Hello and welcome to this latest episode of Suits and Boots, the TDI Sustainability Podcast. I'm Assheton Stewart Carter, CEO of TDI Sustainability. In this episode, we'll be talking about the Omnibus package of regulatory amendments recently published by the EU Commission. Now, if this were last year, this would be quite an esoteric, even rarefied topic. But today, we're in a very different type of leadership in the White House and the very particular style of international trade policy and strategy. So now this topic is almost mainstream. The Omnibus package is a result of the EU Commission's review of key sustainability regulations, which some would say represents a significant rollback on the EU's leadership in sustainability issues globally. Others do say that this, in fact, is a common sense balancing of the green agenda with economic policy expediency, especially in the context of a more dangerous world in which we now live. And the EU industrial policy is changing colour from green to battleship grey is wholly justified in some people's minds. In this discussion today, we'll outline what the key changes are that the Omnibus package brings, what the impacts of these changes will be for businesses, and consider what this means for sustainability and supply chain due diligence more generally. I'm delighted to be joined today for this discussion by my colleague at TDI Sustainability, Jeannette Greven, and former EU insider, Peter Handley. Peter is a policy shaper and an international negotiator with experience in energy and climate, circular economy and international trade negotiations. He worked at the European Commission for 20 years, where he was head of the unit for energy-intensive industries and raw materials. Peter is also a special advisor to the Global Council for Responsible Transition Minerals, a Paris Peace Forum initiative. And Peter's recently founded Phase 32, which is an independent consultancy working on sustainability and resilience. TDI's Jeannette is a senior sustainability consultant with a background in international development and qualitative research in conflict-affected areas. Jeannette works on projects that range from developing responsible sourcing strategies to engagement with artisanal mining communities. Welcome, Jeannette and Peter. Peter, I gave a very kind of brief introduction, which I think probably only touches the surface of what you've done over the last 20 years in the EU Commission. Could you give us a little bit of an explanation or a description of what you were working on for the last 20 years of relevance to this topic today? Because I think it's actually extremely relevant, and some of your activities in the recent past have affected some of these new regulations and changes to regulations that are coming out now.
Yeah, thanks for that. In fact, I've worked for a shade longer than 20 years, and my very first job in the EU was on commodities, these UNCTAD commodity conferences. I was dealing with tropical timber, natural rubber, coffee and cocoa. So I've always had a bit of a red thread through my career of environment development coming together. It's in the last 5 or 6 years that I've been responsible for raw materials policy in the industry part of the Commission. And during that time, the policy has gone from being a technical niche to being one that's at the forefront of global geopolitics, as you only have to see by reading the newspapers from one day to the next. Concretely, what I was doing with my team was setting up strategic partnerships with resource-rich countries, looking for win-win benefits on both sides, developing the first ever European critical raw materials regulation, also trying to deal with some of the international cooperation amongst like-minded countries, so as part of the Minerals Security Partnership, for example.
Excellent. Then we'll come back in the session today a little bit to get your reflections and insight on how the EU thinks about these changes and how it sees the future. But first, I'd like to turn to Jeannette. And Jeannette, I wonder if you could give us a little bit of an explainer on the Omnibus package and the regulations that preceded it or are still there but are affected by it.
Sure. So the Omnibus targets 3 key regulations: the taxonomy from 2020, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or the CSRD, from 2023, and the CSDDD, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, from 2024. And originally, companies that were in scope of the CSRD were automatically required to report under the EU taxonomy, and that's no longer the case per the Omnibus. So the scope will be limited to the largest companies with a voluntary opt-in for the majority of companies. The whole set of changes that are coming through in the Omnibus reflect the Commission's apprehension, especially in light of the current global geopolitical climate and the recent Draghi report on the European economic outlook, that the sustainability reporting requirements represent a sort of disproportionate administrative burden for European companies. And the fear is that this burden will cause further economic stagnation in Europe vis-a-vis the rest of the world and harm key competitive targets. So the assumption is that by reducing the scope of the regulations through the omnibus simplification, it will enable Europe to better compete economically.
Thanks for that. And it does sound a little bit about like the regulations are being rowed back on sustainability. But Peter, as a former insider and now able to speak freely, is this what the EU is thinking? Is it really pulling back from its sustainability agenda in favor of economic growth? Or is it fairer to say that this is more a refinement and a kind of a settling of a sensible middle ground?
It's really a recognition that in our enthusiasm to regulate, there hasn't been really taking into account the overall cost of compliance across several regulations. It's not just the ones that are part of this first package. It's a general problem that a lot of reporting requirements and compliance obligations have been put on businesses in the European Union, which is one thing, but also businesses in other countries. And some other countries have seen things like the deforestation regulation as disguised trade barriers designed to make it harder to export their products to the European market. Plus, there have also been complaints that it's very hard for small and medium-sized enterprises, let's say coffee growers or cocoa growers or rubber growers, let alone small and artisanal miners, to comply with very heavy requirements coming out of the European Union. So I would argue that there is no weakening of the commitment to sustainability, but there is a recognition of the need to tone down the amount of workload and the amount of reporting that can trickle down from a first-tier company, let's say an original equipment manufacturer, asking its suppliers to ask their suppliers, until you finally get to very small companies that are faced with a lot of very difficult and very costly things to deliver.
So if it's not a watering down of the environmental sustainability expectations, why would it need to change? And I guess we should ask, what are some of those key changes that you think those changes that have been made, but you think won't water down the regulations?
Well, it's a bit of a Pareto effect thing in the sense that what they have done, both on the lightening of the obligations under the sustainability reporting and under the due diligence, it's to say, where's the most impact taking place? And by and large, it's the larger companies which are responsible for the largest negative impacts. And therefore, what the argument is we can get 80% of the benefit that we're looking for in terms of sustainability and transparency if we cut out the smaller and medium-sized companies that are not contributing so much to the problem, but which would have a disproportionate reporting and compliance burden. So that's the first thing, cutting out the SMEs. The second thing is giving an extra bit of time for implementation. And another thing is not trying to introduce a brand new European civil liability regime, but rather to lean in on the fact that all of the European member states already have one of their own that works pretty well. So not over-harmonizing where it's not necessary. And I think a very important provision is that narrow the scope of these regulations to the larger companies, making sure that those larger companies don't get round that by still insisting that their upstream small and medium suppliers have to do detailed compliance reporting that they would otherwise not be obliged to do. But essentially, the European Commission still wants to improve the transparency and the traceability because it's important to provide a good degree of assurance about what's going into the European single market.
So if I'm a large company operating in the EU, I would be required to still have visibility of my supply chain, but not require some of the smaller companies, the SMEs in my supply chain, to carry out their own due diligence upstream of their operations.
That's how I understand it, yes, Assheton.
But some things haven't changed. So what are the things that should remain constant?
Well, there's still this concept of double materiality, which means that companies that stay in the scope will still have to report on two things. The first thing being how sustainability risks affect their business, and the second being how their company's activities impact on people and the environment in the places where they're operating.
Got it. And what do you think the effect of this new package will bring to businesses generally? I mean, I guess the underlying question is here: will it enable them to continue to be competitive globally?
The European Commission has, in making these proposals for these simplification omnibus packages, expressed a quantified figure for how much it's going to save businesses on a one-off and recurring basis. And it's in the billions of euros. And I think that is a clear sign that the European Commission is intending to try and make it easier for businesses to be competitive while engaging in activities that can improve sustainability and transparency along the supply chain. So just trying to make it easier to comply, improve competitiveness. And this competitiveness question is becoming central to the European Union's policies under the second von der Leyen Commission. And it really needs to be seen in the following way. We don't abandon the whole decarbonisation, sustainability Green Deal, but we put a competitiveness and reindustrialisation and investment and innovation dimension alongside it. And actually, increasingly, particularly this year, we have to add a third dimension to it, which is security and defence.
And Jeannette, at TDI Sustainability, you work with companies of all different sizes, some of the world's biggest companies and also SMEs. What should companies that are still in scope of CSRD, CSDDD do next to make sure they're ready for the new deadlines?
So, I mean, I think, first of all, since these changes have come about fairly quickly and they're not finalized yet, it will be important for companies to continue to follow the updates from the Commission and to understand precisely when they will be required to report. And then I think since the upstream due diligence requirements are shifting in terms of who is in scope precisely, it will be important for companies that are still in scope to figure out how they're going to gather that information about their supply chain with the new requirements for companies lifted from smaller companies.
And Jeannette, you heard from Peter that the EU wants to through this omnibus package, wants to make life easier for the small and medium-sized enterprises. Do you have the same understanding and optimism that Peter has that the smaller companies who are part of these international supply chains won't be affected?
I think we see from our clients who are both quite downstream and very large, and those that are more in the midstream, that there's not really a way to get around needing information from the upstream in order to have a resilient supply chain. So whether or not it's specifically for these reporting requirements, in order to understand the risk exposure that you have as a company and to both the factual circumstances of your supply chain with regards to environment and human rights, but also where are your materials coming from and what are the blockages and bottlenecks in the supply chain, there's not really a way to get around requiring that information to come from upstream. So I'm perhaps a bit less optimistic that by reducing the reporting burden, we're necessarily going to see that companies are better placed to navigate all of the dynamics in supply chains these days.
There might not be a regulatory requirement, but those smaller companies upstream of the larger companies which are covered by this, by the regulations, would maybe favoured if they had available that data and were able to flow that information downstream. So there's a sort of de facto effect from the regulation, even if not strictly required. I'd like to turn now a little bit to the bigger picture, the context that we're in at the moment. And of course, there's been an enormous amount of changes since President Trump has come into office. Before that, a book which came out, I think, a couple of years ago, right, Peter, called The Brussels Effect, pointed to the European Commission as the global regulator. Do you think that this omnibus package signals the end of that role for Brussels, or does it, in fact, in some way, leave open an opportunity for it to strengthen that role?
I think in the last couple of years, there's been a bit of a realization in the Brussels world that maybe there's been a bit of excessive regulation. And when you look at the real world effects of where investments are taking place, you've seen that quite a few investments that were planned in Europe have actually flipped over to the United States because their approach was different. It was more about financial incentives and fairly straightforward ways to qualify for subsidies in the clean energy and clean mobility space compared to very onerous, very project by project approaches that European Union was developing. So I heard Macron say something like, Europe is the world's leader in regulation and America in investment. So we have to think very much about how to get more investments and more innovation to market in the European Union, and definitely to reverse a trend of deindustrialization and the loss of many of the core industries, steel, aluminium, chemicals, and others, as well as the hollowing out of the European automotive value chain due to developments particularly driven by China, which has taken a march on the rest of the world in that particular value chain. So it's really a wake-up time, and that means that there needs to be more thought about Europe's economic interests, particularly when many of the things we've relied on as a context for the last several decades appear to be very, very vulnerable, if not in danger of disappearing.
Quite. And you said in your opening remarks that the Omnibus package covered 3-4 regulations, but there's more to come. So is this just the beginning? And what does this mean for the European Green Deal as a whole?
But the European Green Deal as a whole is not in danger. I think the European Union is still one of the lighthouses trying to lead the way in terms of addressing climate change, and also of a very strong commitment to good governance in all parts of the world, the respect of law, and doing things the right way in terms of not encouraging corruption and bribery. So I think that the Green Deal, combined with this industrial dimension and now this new security and defense dimension, is going to be a strong driver of renewing the European mission. And I think it's going to lead to a differentiation that some other countries around the world are going to appreciate even more than they did a year or so ago. Because at the same time as you have China pursuing its policies the way it always has, you now have the United States cancelling all the gains of the last few years in terms of anti-corruption, anti-bribery, they've made moves against transparency in supply chains. They've made moves against clean energy in resource-rich countries. So basically, it's probably still only the European Union that's really leading this kind of engagement with resource-rich countries, which is something that they are very keen to have. It's one thing to say America first. It's another thing to say, as Commission President von der Leyen has said, when we engage with a third country, you know what you're getting. It's going to be a more stable partnership, and we're as interested in helping you to move along the value chain and develop your society and economic welfare as we are in our own economic interest. There's a meeting point for the two, and that is, as I say, it's not what America First is doing.
So there's the trust born out of reliability and predictability, which is important, and if you can demonstrate that the sustainability ambitions of the EU are in line with the long-term interests of the trading partners, then that is going to be an attractive proposition compared with countries who flip and change their ideas, I think is what you're saying. So, some people will you be excused to believing that there's a trend towards deregulation, but you feel that maybe because there's a large megaphone coming from the United States, but in fact, underlying, it's not about deregulation, it's more about realignment and finding that overlap in interests of industrialization and long-term sustainability goals.
Yes, I think it's. I think this commission has got the message that it should stop producing regulatory sausages every 5 minutes because, there's already a lot of regulation out there and it needs to be digested. And I think the key driver of this series of simplification omnibuses is to rebalance the implementation of what's already been put before without losing the spirit of it.
Yeah, I think there's a comment out of the United States is that the EU just loves to be regulated, but probably not really. We want effective regulation, I think, is what we're probably after. And I have to ask, so you saw, I'm sure, the letter coming out of Congress or the call for members of the US Congress to action against the CSDDD and the CSRD. What do you think would be the EU's response to that?
I don't know when this podcast goes out, but this will probably be old news by the time it does. This is just one in a whole series of shock announcements that's coming out of the US administration at the moment. But clearly, it's not a friendly act to say no American company should comply with the European Union's transparency and due diligence requirements because it's extraterritoriality. I think up until a month or two ago, we would all have been on the same page in terms of we can work together around the world towards more transparent supply chains. And so I would argue that the aberration here is perhaps more on the US side than the European one.
And Jeannette, I want to kind of turn to you and talk a little bit about your views on, or advice, I think, perhaps to businesses as they enter into this, what seems like a new world. But before I do that, have you got any reflections on the response that Peter has provided?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting moment just to see how this all plays out. But I would say that from my perspective, with regards to the Brussels effect, I think what's kind of disconcerting is just to see it seems as though the EU is reacting rather than leading, whereas with the regulations around sustainability, you could see that there was a clear approach and a sort of a consensus and a leading role globally, whether or not the full enforcement and whether or not they regulated more than they could actually put into practice is a topic of discussion, and I can see your points there. But I think that it's a bit disconcerting to see. It seems the EU reacting to the US rather than the EU having a completely separate approach. And then I think also sitting in Berlin, this has been a huge topic of conversation in German politics this year, the bureaucratic burden and what's causing stagnation in the German economy. And I must say, I really don't think it's the sustainability regulations. There's a whole slew of other causes of bureaucracy and administrative burden that are obstacles to growth in Germany. And I don't think that it's accurate to assume that the sustainability regulations by themselves are going to create a huge change for growth there.
That's an interesting point you make, actually, about, whether the EU should react as robustly as it has and as quickly as it has, rather pause. I mean, if you play out the game theory of this, if you're the country holding a surplus, a trade surplus in a trade war, you inevitably lose. So is this the right response? I don't know, Peter, what do you think about that? Should the EU be responding so quickly and robustly, or should the EU be taking a longer-term view and ploughing its own furrow?
I think the European Union is not deviating from its long-term plans. As I say, the Green Deal continues, but with this industrial dimension and this drive to reduce red tape. And I wouldn't say that what's come out in February, the Clean Industrial Deal and the simplification package, is a reaction to the Trump administration. This is part and parcel of the political program that's been developed during last year in the guidelines that Ursula von der Leyen presented, but also in the reports of Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi. I mean, it's very much about trying to address the competitiveness deficit and the widening gap between growth in Europe and in the United States, which at the end of the day translates into the stability of the economic and social system in Europe, whether people are happy with the system or tempted to move to support extremes. And so it's really coming down to people's jobs and people's hope for the future.
And Jeannette, the question I was going to ask you before then is, what advice, broad advice, do you give your clients at TDI? Is sustainability still a priority?
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective and working with clients across commodities and across all sorts of geographies, it's really an essential practice to understand your upstream supply chain to the broadest extent possible. Whether, as we mentioned, whether or not you do that to comply with a regulation depends on the context, but it's clear that downstream companies' ability to operate is not impacted simply by their immediate business partners, and it's the risk exposure upstream that puts them in a bind, particularly if issues arise and they don't know the actors involved or they have little leverage. So we see this really regularly in complex supply chains, and I think doing due diligence and understanding both financial and non-financial risk, environmental and human rights in particular, is just good practice in terms of building resilience in your supply chain. So that would be our advice to clients.
And it seems to me that if the EU were to halt, and Peter's saying it's not, but if it were to, it wouldn't really help its long-term competitiveness, because China, while China is accountable for 35% of global greenhouse gas emissions, it's also the leader in many of these clean energy technologies, including electric vehicles, and they're going to continue. And so if the European manufacturers don't keep a pace, they'll fall behind. I think that supports your point.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, the reality of European supply chains for many of those critical transition technologies is that they are very dependent on imports. And from our perspective, knowing who's importing and further upstream what is happening is a boon to your business. There's no reason not to do your due diligence and to better understand your supply chain.
Jeannette, TDI Sustainability completed a review of the EU's conflict minerals regulation commissioned by the Commission. What did we learn about the implementation of regulations through that exercise?
We did this study for the EU Commission on the conflict minerals regulation, which was looking at the implementation of the OECD due diligence guidance, essentially, in upstream for EU importers. And one of the main findings of that was really that the EU had sort of bitten off more than it could chew in terms of the implementation. And so that's we would assume that informs some of these other due diligence regulations, and that the enforcement is quite challenging if the scope is so global.
What are some of the benefits of voluntary compliance and reporting?
So in terms of voluntary compliance, I think that if you watch some of the press conferences from the Commission, what they're hoping for and what we anticipate is that the public and consumers will still demand that companies that want to set themselves apart in terms of their sustainability performance continue to comply with the regulation. And that way they can make a claim about the integrity of their supply chains and still show their credentials. So voluntary compliance in that regard will be a good way to do that. If we take that a step further, then with regards to reporting, having that data in place and being able to have an overview of the realities of your supply chain upstream is also a strength, as we've mentioned. So for companies that fall in the supply chain of some of the bigger companies that are still in scope of the sustainability regulations, they will still be asked for information for the downstream companies' due diligence. So it'll be essential to have a systematic way of gathering and presenting that information.
So we're drawing near the end of the session. But I'd like to ask you both one more question each, a little bit of a crystal ball question, always difficult and speculative, especially now when things are moving so fast. But if you were to cast your minds ahead 3 years, where do you see the EU, Peter, on regulation?
Well, I would say that the European Union will continue to regulate, because under the competitiveness compass and the clean industrial deal, it's already indicated a plan for the next couple of years, and some of these things will require legislation. For example, quite a lot of what's planned for the energy-intensive industries has to be put in the form of regulation in the decarbonisation accelerator plan for later in 2025. The circular economy stuff is promised for 2026. But I think the Commission is going to be much more conscious of the competitiveness and cost of compliance and the burden on small and medium-sized enterprises for every piece of legislation that it comes out with from now on. So yes, the European Union is basically driven by law, respect for law, and European regulations which enshrine that law. What it's not so good at is effective implementation and delivery, and that's, I think, a lesson that's been learned over the last political cycle. One point that I think is worth making is that sometimes regulation can have unintended consequences. And, for example, pushing too hard on the button of the due diligence and having to know everything about the supply chain can just lead some companies to say, oh, it's all too much trouble, I will go to different markets. And, it's the whole point about whether you should disengage or engage and try and improve situations. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And Jeannette, and for your clients at TDI Sustainability, I think I've heard quite a few companies say they're now going to shed the term ESG and say they're going to go back to basics. Is this the right move? And where do you see in 3 years' time companies being on sustainability, ESG?
I think, obviously they have to respond to the moment, but it does seem clear to me that this has been a sort of abrupt change in terms of, particularly in the US more, but the sudden dropping of ESG or some of the other kind of contemporary social concerns that companies had. And I think that companies should be responsive, but they should also be aware that it is a moment and that some of the key issues that underpin the sustainability regulations, climate change and concern for human rights in supply chains, those are going to continue to persist, and they will also come back into the public eye. And I think we can assume that whereas right now there's a lot of uncertainty and concern about these big geopolitical issues, I don't think that climate change or concern for human rights and issues like child labor and forced labor are going to completely disappear from what consumers are worried about. So I would urge companies to think about the long run as well.
And that seems like a great note to end on. Let's not act or overreact in the moment, but look towards the long-term goal of planetary sustainability and economic sustainability. In terms of the Omnibus package, the proposed changes will now be submitted to the EU Parliament and Council for approval. The EU Commission has requested that the package is treated with a priority. In particular, the proposals postponing disclosure requirements under the CSRD and the deadline for the transposition of the CSDDD. It's clear from our discussion today that despite the significant perceived rollback on the EU's leadership on sustainability issues that the Omnibus package represents, identification and mitigation of supply chain risk is essential for ensuring long-term business productivity and resilience. We therefore encourage listeners not to see the Omnibus changes as a reason to deprioritize supply chain traceability and sustainability. Indeed, in light of the rush for the critical minerals required for the clean energy transition, it's never been more important to understand and manage the risks in your supply chains. Please do get in touch if you have any questions about the Omnibus regulation or what it means for your business. Thanks for listening to this episode of Suits and Boots. Thank you to our speakers for joining us today.